There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, moments that retrospectively become the very architecture of your future. They are the load-bearing walls, the foundational stones you didn't even realize were being laid. For me, one of those moments smelled of fresh linen and the low, electric hum of a spinning dryer. It was a Tuesday. It was laundry. It was nothing, and then it was everything. Alex had his hand braced on the wall just beside my head, the other resting on the cool enamel of the washing machine, effectively caging me in. He was smiling, but it wasn't his usual, easy grin that he gave to everyone, the one that was as much a part of him as his name. This one was different. It was sharp at the edges, a question and a statement all at once, and it was aimed directly at me, a weaponized form of charm I had never been the target of before. The space between us, usually a comfortable, friendly expanse, had collapsed into a few inches of superheated, crackling air. I could feel the vibrations of the machine through the small of my back, a rhythmic, thumping pulse that seemed to be counting down to something I couldn't name. It hadn't always been like this. For 6 years, the space between Alex and me had been a known quantity, a safe and predictable territory governed by the unspoken laws of our friendship. We met in college, two gangly freshmen trying out for the swim team, both of us smelling perpetually of chlorine and exhaustion. He was the sun, and I was the satellite caught in his orbit. Alex moved through the world with an unconscious grace, an effortless confidence that drew people to him like moths. He was all bright laughter, easy conversation, and a casual physicality that seemed to extend to everyone equally. He'd sling an arm over your shoulder, clap you on the back, or lean into your space to hear a story in a loud room without a second thought. It was just how he was wired. I, on the other hand, was built of quieter materials. I watched. I listened. I preferred the periphery, finding my comfort in observation rather than participation. My camera became my native language, a way to frame the world and interact with it from a safe distance. Our friendship was forged in the crucible of 5 a.m. practices, in the shared agony of ice baths and the bleary-eyed solidarity of team breakfasts. We were different in nearly every way, yet we fit together like two mismatched puzzle pieces that somehow completed the same picture. He pulled me out of my shell, and I think, provided him with a quiet harbor, a place where he didn't have to perform. He could just be. And somewhere in those thousands of shared hours, in the echoing natatorium, the cramped dorm rooms, the long bus rides to away meets, I had fallen in love with him. It wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic event. It was a slow erosion, a gradual seeping of affection into the bedrock of my being until I couldn't remember a time when the sight of his smile didn't send a quiet, painful jolt through my system. I kept it buried, of course. I built a fortress around the feeling, reinforcing its walls with every casual mention of a girl he was seeing, every piece of dating advice he asked for. My love for him became a secret room inside myself, a place I visited only when I was alone, late at night, replaying some small, insignificant moment from the day. The way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the specific cadence of his voice when he was tired, the unconscious way he'd run a hand through his perpetually messy hair. Loving him from a distance was a form of self-preservation. He was my best friend, the most important constant in my life, and I would have sooner cut off my own arm than risk that foundation for a feeling I was certain he could never return. His world was populated by bright, beautiful women who matched his energy, who laughed as loudly as he did. I was just Leo. Steady, quiet, reliable Leo. The friend, the observer, the keeper of secrets, the biggest one of all being my own. For years, this dynamic worked. He dated Sarah, a smart, funny art history major who I genuinely liked, and I played my part. I was the supportive friend, the third wheel who knew when to make himself scarce, the sounding board for their minor squabbles. I learned to live with the dull ache in my chest, to treat it as a chronic condition, something to be managed rather than cured. I photographed their happiness, framing it in perfect light, my lens a barrier between my heart and their reality. They were a beautiful couple, and the part of me that loved Alex unconditionally was genuinely happy for him. The other part, the secret, selfish part, felt like it was slowly turning to dust. The shift, when it came, was not a gentle tremor but a seismic event that fractured the landscape of our lives. It started with a phone call just after midnight on a rainy Wednesday 6 months ago. I was in my darkroom, the faint, acidic smell of fixer clinging to the air, watching an image of a winter landscape slowly emerge in the developing tray. The shrill ring of my phone was a violent intrusion. It was Alex. His voice was a wreck, a shredded version of its usual confident tone. "She left, Leo. She just packed her stuff, and she's gone." There was nothing I could say that would fix it. All I could offer was the same thing I had always offered him, a safe place to land. An hour later, he was on my doorstep, soaked from the rain, his face pale and hollowed out in the dim light of my porch. He looked like a ship that had been torn from its moorings, adrift and taking on water. I pulled him inside, and he collapsed onto my sofa, the story spilling out of him in a torrent of grief and confusion. For years gone, a shared apartment, a shared life, dismantled in a single afternoon while he was at work. He didn't cry, not really. Instead, he just seemed to deflate, all the light and energy that defined him draining away until he was just a man huddled under a blanket on my couch, staring at nothing. That was the first night, the first of many. I didn't offer the spare room. It felt too formal, too much like banishing him. I just let him be, bringing him a glass of water and turning the television to some mindless, late-night program. I sat in the armchair across from him, pretending to watch, my senses on high alert. I was hyper-aware of every small sound he made, the ragged hitch of his breath, the rustle of the blanket, the soft, defeated sighs that punctuated the silence. Sometime around 3 in the morning, his breathing evened out, deepening into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. He had curled in on himself, his face half buried in one of my couch cushions, looking younger and more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. A lock of damp hair had fallen across his forehead. My fingers twitched with the overwhelming, idiotic urge to brush it away. I clenched my fist, my nails digging into my palm, and anchored myself to the familiar pain. This was not for me. This was Triov. I was his friend, and he was hurting. That was all it was. That was all it could ever be. I stayed in that chair until the first gray light of dawn crept through the window, a silent, useless sentinel. The next day, he went back to his now empty apartment, a place haunted by the ghosts of a shared future. But that night, he was back on my couch. And the night after that, a new, unspoken ritual began to form, a pattern woven into the fabric of our evenings. He would come over after work, bringing takeout or just his own exhausted presence. We would talk, or not talk. We'd watch movies he didn't see, listen to music he didn't hear. He was present and absent all at once, a ghost in my living room. And every night, he would eventually succumb to a bone-deep weariness, drifting off to sleep on the sofa. I would wait until I was sure he was truly asleep before draping a blanket over him, my movements slow and careful, a silent prayer against waking him. My apartment, once my solitary sanctuary, became a shared space, filled with the constant, low-grade hum of his grief and my own tightly leashed yearning. His presence was a strange mix of comfort and torture. Having him so close, so consistently, was something my secret heart had always craved, but the circumstances made it agonizing. I was his emotional medic, his safe harbor, and the role required a clinical distance I was struggling to maintain. My living room transformed into a liminal space, a territory between friendship and something more intimate that only I was aware of. The air itself felt charged with unspoken things, with the sheer weight of his sadness and my suffocating affection. I learned the topography of his sleeping form, the way his shoulders curved, the slight parting of his lips, the way one hand would often be tucked under his cheek. I was cataloging details that were not mine to keep, collecting moments of stolen intimacy that felt both precious and profoundly wrong. After a couple of weeks, the pretense that this was a temporary arrangement began to wear thin. One evening, as he was gathering his things to leave, a formality we both knew would end with him back on my couch in a few hours, he stopped at the door and turned back to me. "You know," he said, his voice quiet. I could just bring a bag, some clothes, a toothbrush, if that's okay, just for a little while. The silence over there it's too loud. The request was a new threshold. It was a formal acknowledgement of his need, a shift from an impromptu arrangement to a semi-permanent one. A part of me, the logical, self-protective part, screamed that this was a terrible idea, a dangerous blurring of boundaries that could only end in disaster for me. But the part that loved him, the part that couldn't bear the thought of him alone in that empty apartment, won out easily. Of course, I said, my voice betraying none of the turmoil inside me. Stay as long as you need, and so he did. He moved into my guest room, a small, spare space I mostly used for storing camera equipment. But he rarely slept there. The ritual of the couch continued, as if the living room was the only place he felt truly safe. Sometimes, I would wake in the middle of the night and find him standing in the hallway, caught between the guest room and the living room, looking lost. On those nights, I would get up, feigning a need for water, and gently steer him back to the sofa, a silent act of guidance he seemed to accept without question. The door to his room was always left ajar, a sliver of light from the hallway spilling across the floor. I saw it as a metaphor for his state of being, not quite closed off, but not fully open either. Just uncertain. My life began to revolve around him, around his healing. I learned to anticipate his moods, to know when he needed to talk and when he needed the comfortable quiet of my presence. I cooked for him, simple meals he barely tasted but ate because I put them in front of him. I made sure the coffee was ready in the morning. I was building a routine around him, a domesticity that felt terrifyingly real. It was like playing house, but only one of us knew the game. I was living a fragile, borrowed dream, and I knew, with a certainty that was a constant, cold knot in my stomach, that it was all temporary. One day he would heal. He would wake up, the fog of his grief would have lifted, and he would move back into his own life, leaving my apartment feeling cavernously empty and my heart in ruins. The knowledge was a constant companion, a ghost at the feast of his proximity. Slowly, incrementally, he began to return to himself. The hollow look in his eyes began to recede. He started to actually watch the movies we put on, to laugh at the stupid jokes. He talked about work, about friends, about things other than Sarah. The heavy blanket of grief was being lifted, corner by corner. And as his own personality began to reemerge, something else shifted between us. The physical space, which had been defined by his need for inert comfort, began to change. He was still on my couch every night, but the way he was there felt different. One night, during a movie, he shifted, stretching out his long legs and resting his head in my lap. He did it so casually, so naturally, that I froze, my entire body going rigid. He didn't seem to notice, his eyes fixed on the screen. I sat there for the entire 2-hour film, my muscles screaming, my heart pounding a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. I could feel the warmth of his scalp through my jeans, smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo. It was the most exquisite torture I had ever known. It became a new part of the ritual. His head in my lap, my hand, after an agonizing internal debate, eventually resting tentatively on his shoulder or in his hair. He would sigh, a sound of pure contentment, and relax into the touch. For him, I reasoned, this was nothing. It was the same casual, thoughtless physicality he had always possessed, now directed at his closest friend in a time of need. He was a tactile person seeking comfort. It meant nothing more. I repeated this mantra to myself over and over, a desperate attempt to keep my own spiraling hope in check. But it was a losing battle. Each touch, each quiet moment of closeness, was a drop of water on the stone of my resolve, slowly wearing it away. He started to touch me more outside of the couch ritual, too. A hand on my arm to get my attention. A shoulder brushing against mine as we cooked in my small kitchen. He would stand closer than necessary, leaning over my shoulder to look at the photos I was editing on my computer, his breath warm against my neck. Each instance was a small electric shock to my system. I was a cartographer charting a new, terrifying landscape, where every landmark was an ambiguous gesture, every river a current of unspoken meaning. Was I imagining it? Was I projecting my own desperate desire onto the simple actions of a grieving friend? The uncertainty was maddening. I felt like I was losing my mind, caught in a feedback loop of hope and fear. He was rebuilding himself, and he seemed to be using me as the scaffolding. But what would happen when the building was complete? The process was like watching a photograph develop in the darkroom. At first, there is nothing, just a blank sheet of paper submerged in chemicals. Then, slowly, faint shadows begin to appear, blurry and undefined. You can't be sure what the final image will be. You just have to wait, holding your breath, as the shapes resolve, as the lines sharpen. With Alex, I was in that blurry, in-between stage. I could see the faint outlines of something new emerging between us, but I had no idea what the final picture would look like. It could be a masterpiece, or it could be a ruined, overexposed mess. All I could do was wait in the darkness and hope, which brought us here, to the laundry room. It was a mundane Tuesday night, another brick in the foundation of our strange, shared life. We had fallen into a rhythm of domestic chores, and laundry was his designated task, a small way for him to contribute. I had come in to grab something, and he was pulling my t-shirts from the dryer, the warm, clean scent filling the small space. He was humming, a sure sign that he was in a good mood, a real mood, not the fragile performance of one. He looked up as I entered, and that new, sharp-edged grin spread across his face. He took a deliberate step forward, and another, until my back was pressed against the gently vibrating machine. "Leo," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate with the hum of the dryer. He said my name like it was a discovery, like he was tasting it for the first time. And I was trapped by his arms, by the washing machine, by the 6 years of unspoken feelings that were now roaring in my ears like a flash flood. My mind was a frantic scramble of possibilities, 1,000 branching paths of what this could mean, each one more terrifying than the last. This wasn't the inert comfort-seeking of the past few months. This was different. This was active. This was intentional. The air crackled, thick with everything we had never said. His eyes searched mine, and for the first time, I felt truly seen by him. Not as a friend, not as a caretaker, but as something else. And in his gaze, I saw an echo of my own terrifying, exhilarating uncertainty. He was just as lost as I was. The grin faltered for a fraction of a second, revealing the raw vulnerability beneath it. He was standing on a precipice, and he had just pulled me there with him. I could feel the rhythmic thump of the dryer against my spine, a steady metronome counting down the seconds of my old life before the freefall began. My breath caught in my throat. The entire universe seemed to have shrunk to the space between our bodies, a supercharged vacuum where the normal rules of physics and friendship no longer applied. His eyes, which I knew as well as my own, were a shade darker. The usual easygoing blue deepened to the color of a storm-tossed sea. The playful grin was still there, but it was a facade, a mask for the raw, unvarnished question in his gaze. He was asking for something, and for the first time, I had no idea what the right answer was. Every safe, established boundary we had ever built between us was dissolving in the humid, linen-scented air. My role had always been so clear, the steady shore to his turbulent ocean. But now, he was pulling me into the water, and I could feel the undertow tugging at my ankles. "Alex," I managed to breathe out, my voice barely a whisper. His name was a question, a plea, a warning. He leaned in closer, the scent of him, that familiar mix of his soap and the clean cotton of his shirt, overwhelming my senses. My hands, which had been at my sides, came up instinctively to rest on his chest, intending to push him away, to re-establish the safe distance we had always maintained. But the moment my palms made contact with the solid warmth of him, the intention vanished. My fingers curled into the soft fabric of his shirt instead, gripping it like a lifeline. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic, wild rhythm that mirrored my own. He wasn't as calm as he appeared. He was just as terrified as I was. That realization changed everything. This wasn't a game. It wasn't a thoughtless act of physical familiarity. This was a deliberate, calculated risk. He was stepping off a cliff and trusting that I would either catch him or jump with him. The grin finally faded completely, replaced by an expression of such open, aching vulnerability that it stole the air from my lungs. "Leo," he said again, his voice softer this time, rough with an emotion I couldn't decipher. "Just stay still." And then he closed the remaining distance. His lips met mine, and the world tilted on its axis. It wasn't a hard, demanding kiss. It was hesitant, searching, a question asked in a language we had never spoken but both instinctively understood. It was soft and warm and tasted faintly of the coffee he'd had an hour ago. The thrumming of the dryer behind me faded into a distant buzz, my entire consciousness focused on the single point of contact, this impossible, earth-shattering connection. A tidal wave of 6 years of repressed longing crashed over me, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I felt a tremor run through him as my hands tightened their grip on his shirt, pulling him closer, answering his question with a desperation that shocked me. The kiss deepened, losing its initial tentativeness and gaining a new, desperate confidence. It was a conversation held without words, a frantic exchange of all the things we couldn't say. It was "I'm so lost," and "I'm right here." It was "I'm terrified," and "so am I." It was the shattering of 1,000 unspoken rules, the demolition of the fortress I had so carefully constructed around my heart. And in the wreckage, there was this beautiful, terrifying, impossible thing. When he finally pulled back, we were both breathless, foreheads resting against each other. His eyes were closed, his expression a mixture of relief and disbelief. I stared at the freckles scattered across the bridge of his nose, details I had memorized from a distance, now suddenly, intimately close. The silence that fell between us wasn't awkward. It was heavy, weighted with the enormity of what had just happened. A line had been crossed, a seal had been broken, and there was no going back to the comfortable, painful safety of before. He opened his eyes, and the stormy blue was clear now, calm. He looked at me, really looked at me, and a slow, genuine smile touched his lips. It wasn't the sharp, challenging grin from before. It was something new, something soft and private and meant only for me. "Oh," he breathed out, a single, wondering syllable. "So that's what that was." He didn't explain what that was. He didn't have to. It was the strange, magnetic pull that had been growing between us for months. It was the reason he slept on my couch instead of in a perfectly good bed. It was the reason his head fit so perfectly in my lap. It was the electric current that ran between us every time we accidentally touched. It was this feeling, this enormous, unnamed thing that had been living in the silence, and we had finally, clumsily, given it a voice. But the voice was fleeting. The aftermath of the kiss was not a seamless transition into a new reality. It was more like the stunned, ringing silence after an explosion. We stood in the laundry room for a moment longer, suspended in a fragile bubble of discovery. Then, the real world intruded. The dryer buzzed, signaling the end of its cycle. The sound was jarring, a harsh reminder of the mundane world we still had to navigate. Alex blinked, pulling back fully, the physical distance returning, but the emotional landscape between us was forever altered. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I knew well, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. "I should, finish this," he mumbled, turning back to the dryer, his movements suddenly stiff and awkward. The bubble had popped. The magic had dissipated, leaving behind a thick fog of uncertainty. I didn't know what to say. My mind was blank, my emotions a tangled, chaotic mess of elation and terror. I had just been handed the one thing I had wanted for years, and now I had no idea what to do with it. I watched him fold the t-shirt with clumsy, uncoordinated movements, his focus entirely on the mundane task. He was shutting me out, retreating back behind his walls. I could feel the cold dread seeping into my veins. Had I imagined the whole thing? The vulnerability, the connection? Was it just a momentary lapse, an impulse born of grief and proximity that he now regretted? "Alex," I started, but my voice cracked. He didn't turn around. "It's late, Leo. We should probably get some sleep," and that was it. He finished the laundry in a tense, suffocating silence, then carried the basket out of the room. He didn't go to the couch. He went straight to the guest room, and, for the first time since he had started staying with me, he closed the door. Not just ajar. Fully, completely, and quietly closed. The soft click of the latch echoed in the silent apartment like a gunshot. It was a definitive statement. A boundary being re-erected. A door slammed shut on the possibility that had been so breathtakingly real only moments before. I stood alone in the hallway, the warmth of the laundry room at my back and the cold, closed door in front of me. The joy that had flooded me was draining away, replaced by a familiar, gut-wrenching ache. It was worse than before. Before, there had been the dull, manageable pain of unrequited love. This was the sharp, jagged agony of something given and then immediately taken away. I felt like a fool. I had misinterpreted everything. His grief, his need for comfort, his tactile nature. I had woven it all into a narrative that suited my own desires. The kiss wasn't a confession. It was a mistake. His mistake. And my ruin. The next morning was a study in avoidance. He was gone before I even woke up, first. A single, sterile text message was waiting for me. Had to get to work early. See you tonight. There was no mention of what had happened, no acknowledgement of the earthquake that had shaken our world. It was a deliberate, calculated act of pretending. All day, I was a wreck. I couldn't focus. I went to my studio and stared at blank sheets of photographic paper, unable to conjure a single image. My own quiet sanctuary felt like a prison. Every corner of my apartment was haunted by him, by the memory of the kiss, by the deafening silence that had followed. When he came home that evening, he was armed with a forced, brittle cheerfulness. He talked animatedly about his day, about a problem with a server, about a funny email he'd received. He was building a wall of meaningless words between us, and I was letting him. I played my part, nodding and making the appropriate responses, but my heart felt like a lead weight in my chest. We ate dinner with the television on, a buffer against the silence. And when it was over, he didn't gravitate toward the couch. He tidied up the kitchen, said a clipped, "Good night, Leo," and disappeared into the guest room, the door clicking shut behind him once more. This went on for 3 days. 3 days of stilted conversation, of forced normalcy, of him sleeping behind a closed door. 3 days of him carefully maintaining a physical distance of at least 5 feet between us at all times. He was treating me like a stranger, like a polite but distant roommate. The easy intimacy we had built over the last 6 months, the comfortable closeness that had become the very air I breathed, was gone. It had been replaced by this cold, sterile politeness. And it was killing me. I felt like I was suffocating. The hope that had bloomed in the laundry room had withered and died, leaving behind a bitter, toxic residue of resentment and hurt. On the 4th night, I couldn't take it anymore. The silence was louder and more painful than any argument could ever be. He was getting ready to retreat to his room again when I finally found my voice. "Alex, stop." He froze at the door, his back to me. "We need to talk about this," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "You can't just pretend it didn't happen." He was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed, a heavy, weary sound, and slowly turned to face me. The mask of cheerfulness was gone. In its place was an expression of deep, conflicted misery. He looked exhausted. "There's nothing to talk about, Leo," he said, his voice flat. "It was a mistake. I was confused. I'm sorry." Each word was a physical blow. A mistake. Confused. Sorry. The clinical, dismissive terms he used to describe a moment that had felt like a revelation to me. The anger that had been simmering beneath my hurt finally boiled over. "A mistake." I shot back, my voice rising. "Is that what it was?" Because it didn't feel like a mistake. "And don't you dare tell me you were confused. That's a coward's excuse. You knew exactly what you were doing. You've been. I don't even know what you've been doing for months. Leading me on? Using me? What the hell has this been, Alex?" "It's not like that," he insisted, his own voice gaining an edge of desperation. "I would never use you. You're my best friend. Then what is it?" I demanded, taking a step toward him. "Talk to me. For once in your life, stop hiding behind that easy smile and tell me what's actually going on in your head. What was that kiss? What am I to you? Because I can't live in this silence anymore." It's breaking me. He flinched as if I had struck him. He looked cornered, trapped. He paced the small space between us, running a hand through his hair again and again. I don't know, he finally burst out, his voice cracking with a pain that mirrored my own. Okay, I don't know. I've spent my whole life knowing exactly who I am, what I want. It was all simple. I liked girls. I dated Sarah. I was going to marry her. That was the plan. And then it all fell apart. And I was nothing. And you were there. You've always been there. My one constant, solid thing. He stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes pleading. Being here, with you, it was the only time I felt safe. The only time the noise in my head stopped. And I started needing it. Needing you. And I didn't understand it. And then, the other night, I looked at you, and it was like a switch flipped. It wasn't just about feeling safe anymore. I wanted more. And it terrified me. Because I don't know what it means. I'm not. He trailed off, unable to say the word. Gay. He couldn't say it. The label, the identity, it was a foreign country he had accidentally stumbled into, and he didn't speak the language. His entire self-perception, the carefully constructed identity of Alex the golden boy, the ladies' man, was crumbling, and he was panicking. His withdrawal, the closed door, the stilted silence. It wasn't about me. Not really. It was about him. It was the terrified thrashing of a man who had lost his own map. The anger drained out of me, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. He wasn't being cruel. He was just lost and scared. I saw the frightened freshman I'd met all those years ago, the kid trying to project an aura of confidence he didn't quite feel. I closed the distance between us, my movement slow, giving him time to retreat. He stayed put. I reached out and gently took his hand. He flinched but didn't pull away. His skin was cold. Hey, I said softly. Look at me. He lifted his gaze to mine. His eyes were swimming with confusion and fear. You don't have to have it all figured out right now, I told him, my voice quiet but firm. You don't need a label. You don't need a plan. We can just be. We can figure it out together. But you have to talk to me. You can't shut me out. That's the only thing I can't handle. A single tear escaped his eye and tracked a path down his cheek. He squeezed my hand, a desperate, clinging pressure. I'm scared, Leo, he whispered. I know, I whispered back. Me too. And in that shared admission, in that moment of mutual, terrifying vulnerability, the walls between us finally, truly came down. The silence was broken, not by a kiss this time, but by the quiet, earth-shattering power of honesty. We stood there in the middle of my living room for a long time, holding hands, two lost souls finding their bearings in the wreckage of who we used to be. The future was a vast, uncharted territory, but for the first time, it felt like we were finally holding the same map. That conversation was the beginning. Not a magical fix, but the start of a new, deliberate honesty. We talked for hours that night, sitting on the floor of the living room, the couch that had been our silent battlefield now just a piece of furniture. He told me about the confusion he'd felt for months, the magnetic pull toward me that he'd written off as friendship and grief. He spoke of the kiss not as a mistake, but as an inevitability, a moment where his subconscious desires finally overpowered his conscious confusion. I, in turn, confessed the truth of my own feelings, the years of silent affection I had kept locked away. I laid my 6 years of secrets at his feet, a terrifying act of surrender. He listened, his expression shifting from surprise to a kind of dawning, sorrowful understanding. He looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, not just as his friend, but as a person who had been quietly carrying a burden for his sake. There were no grand declarations of love, no promises of forever. It was quieter than that, more fragile. It was an agreement to be patient, to be kind, to navigate this new territory together, one step at a time. When we finally fell silent, exhausted and emotionally raw, the first light of dawn was filtering through the windows. You should get some sleep, I said softly. He nodded, his eyes heavy. He stood up, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought he would turn toward the guest room, that the old pattern of retreat would reassert itself. But he didn't. He just stood there, looking from me to the closed door of the guest room, and then back to me. He held out his hand. It wasn't a gesture of desperation or need this time. It was a simple, clear invitation. I took his hand, and he led me not to the guest room, not to the couch, but to my own bedroom. A room he had barely set foot in during all the months he had been staying with me. It felt like crossing the final threshold, entering the most private, sacred space. He didn't let go of my hand as he pulled back the covers. We slid into bed, the mattress dipping with our combined weight. We lay on our sides, facing each other, the space between us charged with a new, gentle energy. It wasn't the frantic, uncertain crackle of the laundry room. It was a quiet, steady warmth. He reached out and tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear, his touch feather-light and deliberate. "Is this okay?" he whispered, his voice thick with sleep and sincerity. "Yeah," I breathed. "It's okay," he smiled, a true, tired, gentle smile, and closed his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing deepened into the familiar rhythm of sleep. But this time, it was different. He was not a refugee seeking temporary shelter on my couch. He was here, with me, by choice. The closed door of the guest room no longer felt like a rejection. It felt like a relic of a past we had finally moved beyond. I lay awake for a long time, watching him sleep, the pale morning light tracing the contours of his face. The ache in my chest, the one I had carried for so long, was gone. In its place was a quiet, profound sense of peace. It felt like coming home. The days that followed were a process of gentle relearning. We were recalibrating our entire relationship, discovering the new shape of us. The awkwardness was replaced by a shy, tentative intimacy. A hand held while watching a movie. A quick, soft kiss in the kitchen while waiting for the kettle to boil. A shared glance across a room that said more than an hour of conversation. It was all new, all fragile, and we treated it with the care of two people handling something impossibly precious. Alex was learning a new language for his own emotions, and I was learning to trust that what I was seeing was real. There were moments of fear, of course, moments where he would grow quiet, a flicker of the old uncertainty crossing his face. But instead of retreating, he would talk to me. He would voice his anxieties, his fear that he was somehow broken or that he would end up hurting me. And I would listen, and I would reassure him, and I would tell him that we were just two people figuring things out, and that was okay. We were building our foundation not on assumptions or unspoken rules, but on the solid bedrock of communication. The rituals of our life shifted. The couch became just a couch again. Our evenings ended in my bed, falling asleep in the comfortable tangle of each other's limbs. The guest room door remained permanently, blessedly closed. My apartment, which had once felt like a temporary triage center, finally felt like a home for both of us. His things slowly migrated from the guest room into mine. His book appeared on my nightstand. His ridiculously oversized sweatshirt ended up in my drawer. His toothbrush took up residence next to mine in the bathroom. These small, mundane acts of integration felt more significant, more real, than any dramatic romantic gesture ever could. We were weaving our lives together, thread by quiet thread. One Saturday afternoon, a few weeks later, I was in my darkroom, developing photos from a recent shoot. The red safe light cast a warm, surreal glow over everything. I was so engrossed in my work that I didn't hear him come in. I only realized he was there when I felt his arm slide around my waist from behind, his chin resting on my shoulder. He was quiet, just watching me work, his body a warm, solid presence against my back. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured, his voice a low vibration against my ear. I was watching a print of a sunrise over the ocean emerge in the developer tray. It was an image of quiet, hopeful beauty, of a new day breaking. "I was just thinking," I said, leaning my head back against his shoulder, "about how strange it is. How you can look at the same landscape every day and see nothing. And then, one day, the light changes, just slightly. And suddenly you see everything you were missing before. You see how beautiful it was all along." He was silent for a moment. Then he tightened his arms around me, his embrace a secure, comforting anchor. "Yeah," he said softly. "I know what you mean." We stood there for a long time in the quiet, red-lit darkness, watching the image resolve, watching the new day come into focus. It was no longer a blurry, uncertain picture. The lines were sharp, the details were clear. It was a masterpiece, and it was ours. We had found our way out of the darkness, not by rushing towards some imagined, blindingly bright future, but by learning to see in the soft, honest light of the present. We had learned that home wasn't a place, it was a person. It was the beautiful, honest silence we had finally learned to create together.